مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. منذ ما يقارب 100 عام قال الرئيس كالفين كوليدج إن أمل أمريكا هو القيام بالأعمال، مع اقتصاد بقيمة 23 تريليون دولار، أكبر بنسبة 20% من اقتصاد الصين التي هي أقرب منافس للاقتصاد الأمريكي. وهذا أمر يمثل الكثير من الأعمال. وثمة مثل آخر يقول: الأعمال والسياسة لا تمتزجان ببعضهم البعض. هناك الكثير من الأعمال داخل السياسة، وهناك الكثير من السياسة داخل الأعمال. طاولة الأعمال المستديرة هي اتحاد للرؤساء التنفيذيين للشركات الأمريكية الرائدة التي تمثل ما يقارب ثلث اقتصادنا، ويعمل فيها حوالي 20 مليون عامل. هي أحد الأصوات الأكثر نفوذا في واشنطن عند تقاطع الأعمال مع السياسة، وذلك بما يتعلق بكل شيء من الضرائب إلى الهجرة إلى البيئة إلى السياسة الخارجية. وجهات نظر هذه الطاولة تلفت الانتباه بدءا من المكتب البيضاوي وصولا إلى قاعات الكونغرس. لمعرفة المزيد عن دور الأعمال في السياسة يسعدني أن أرحب بالرئيس التنفيذي لطاولة الأعمال المستديرة، إنه أحد أكثر الرجال احتراما في واشنطن، رئيس موظفي البيت الأبيض السابق جوشوا بولتن. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Usually in Washington, business is business and politics is politics, but sometimes the twain do meet. I'm delighted to welcome to today's show the Chief Executive Officer of the Business Roundtable, one of Washington's most influential groups of business executives, Josh Bolton. Josh, welcome. Josh, please tell us, what is the Business Roundtable and why does it exist?
Rob, thank you for having me. Good morning. The Business Roundtable is an organization of 235 chief executive officers of America's biggest companies. It exists in order to reflect their views on major public policy issues to policymakers here in Washington, and not their parochial views, not the oil industry views or the banking industry views, but their views about the big issues that affect the economy and the country overall. And they come together here at the Business Roundtable to make their voice more powerful by doing it collectively and speaking to policymakers, which means the White House and the administration and the Congress, to speak to policymakers on the important issues of the day that they think most affect their businesses overall and the country overall.
And what would you say are the top priorities for America's business community today?
Rob, it varies from time to time. Usually at the very top of the agenda for the Business Roundtable are tax issues, international trade issues, and regulatory issues. But sometimes other issues come up to intervene. Over the past 2 years, the response to the pandemic has been front and center.
So I saw, for example, that the Roundtable issued a very strong condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Why?
Well, we're amplifying the CEO voice. In modern American culture, business leaders are increasingly being looked to by their customers and their employees and their communities to have a voice in public affairs beyond just narrowly running their business. And so the Business Roundtable, when a crisis like the Ukraine crisis comes up, can speak on their behalf so they don't each have to issue their own statement of, in this case, condemnation of the Russian invasion. But the Business Roundtable does it for them collectively.
Let's talk a bit about the politics of business in America. There's a presumption out there that the business community veers right. Is that a fair assumption? And how do you navigate partisanship among what I assume is a pretty broad spectrum in reality of political views, even among America's chief executives?
Yeah, it's actually, I think, an outdated perception to think of business leaders as veering right. These days, they are trying desperately to veer center and try to keep the country on a centrist path, because especially in these times of bitter political division, what the business leaders want is for our policymakers to have sensible, stable, centrist policies that will keep the country on an even path without veering back and forth between rightist and leftist policies. So I would describe the business community now, not the individual political views of the leaders, which are actually all the way across the spectrum, but collectively, with their collective voice, they are radically centrist, and unfortunately, they are trying to protect a shrinking center in American politics.
So, how do you, as the person who has to corral 200 plus executives across the political spectrum, how do you bring them to the center?
It's, I mean, I'd like to say my job is incredibly hard and I'm doing a brilliant job, but the truth is that portion of my job is not that hard. Like I said, they are like, all other Americans with views all across the political spectrum. But what they would like to promote in government, in federal policy, is a centrism that provides sanity and stability. They don't want their government veering off and huge fights about social issues. They want the government taking care of the federal budget. They want the government making sure that the business climate is attractive. They want peace and security around the world. And those are, in my view, kind of centrist values. It is not hard to bring the members around behind that, especially at an organization like the Business Roundtable, where when they come here, they understand that they're not participating in a representation of the parochial interests of their own industry. There are separate industry associations that do that. They are coming together here to represent what they think is best overall for the country.
So if it's not so tough to get centrism among your members, Washington is a political environment where centrism is not the easiest thing to sell these days, given polarization that has made a very strong and vocal right and a very strong and vocal left. So how do you deal, how have you dealt, have you seen this evolve over the last decade or so with administrations of the two different parties?
Yeah, now that part of my job is very hard, and it's a challenge for the whole country of the bitter polarization that has taken hold over the course of the last, certainly the last 2 decades, but in particular over the course of the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years, but particularly as we headed into the Trump administration here. And that's a terribly difficult challenge for the whole country. You know, Rob, the way I described it for my board, even a couple of years ago, was that we are a centrist organization, and we find ourselves on a small and shrinking political island. And over the course of those last 2 years, I had hoped that with the end of the Trump administration, that there might be an opportunity for the country to come together and find more common ground among our political figures. But that hasn't happened. The polarization, if anything, has become more extreme. And exactly how to address that is unclear, because we now find ourselves in a situation where the political system rewards extremists. Most members of the U.S. Congress come from districts that have been, in most cases, intentionally drawn to make it possible for members of their party to win every election. So most members of Congress have nothing to fear in a general election because their party will always win if they have the nomination of their party. And in order to maintain the nomination of their party, they need to appeal to the fringes of their party. In the case of Republicans, it's the far right and Trumpism, nationalism movement. And in the case of the Democratic Party, it's far left progressives. And so the political incentives for all of them are to play to the fringes of their party, who, in my judgment and the judgment of my organization, either side of either of the fringes would lead the country down a very dangerous and destructive path, certainly for our economy and certainly for our culture.
Josh, thank you for beginning to describe to us the difficulties that we face. When we come back after the break, we're going to draw on your experience working in the White House as chief advisor to the president, chief of staff to the president, and see how that experience can help us understand where we are today and where we need to go as a nation. In just a moment. We've had 46 presidents, the most powerful people in the world, but we've had surprisingly few movies about them. George Washington, the father of our country. I can't think of a single major film. Theodore Roosevelt, the swashbuckler of San Juan Hill. Ditto, not one blockbuster. Ulysses Grant, the war hero who was the first two-term Republican president. Well, there are films from the Civil War, none from his time in the White House. And for all those lesser lights who made it there, from Franklin Pierce to Calvin Coolidge, forget it. So, to commemorate President's Day, let's highlight those few films that do tell a president's story. Here are 3. Lincoln, a Steven Spielberg masterpiece about the end of slavery, starring Daniel Day-Lewis as our 16th president. Hyde Park, a slice of Franklin Roosevelt's personal life during the key run-up to the Second World War. And Frost Nixon, the dramatic retelling of the explosive interviews between the ex-president and the famous television personality that were a political boxing match to change the way we view history. I hope Hollywood eventually wakes up and begins to tell the stories of our presidents. But until then, we may have to read a book. Again, my guest today is Joshua Bolten. Josh Bolten is Chief Executive Officer of the Business Roundtable, an organization of CEOs of America's largest corporations. In his 20-year government career, he served as Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Deputy White House Chief of Staff, and ultimately Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. In that capacity, he was one of the president's most trusted advisors. The person the president saw when he arrived in the Oval Office each morning, and who he saw when he left each evening. Josh, you don't work for the American people anymore. Now you work for the Business Roundtable. How is that transition?
Rob, I feel like I still work for the American people. And that's a luxury of the work that I do. Having spent most of my career in government service, here I get to work in the private sector. I get to earn a private sector salary. I get to work with some of the finest business leaders or leaders of any kind in the world today in support of policies that I strongly believe are good for America. So even though I'm not in government service, I like to believe that those of us who work at the Business Roundtable are in public service.
Fair enough. Look, let me ask you about your White House experience and what it can what we can learn from that to look at today's great crisis. You served in the White House during the 9/11 era. You served as Chief of Staff in the wake of the American invasion of Iraq, with Americans fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan in the president's second term. We're now dealing with another foreign policy crisis that may very well define our era, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, war in the heart of Europe. Governing during crisis is a special skill, of course. What advice do you have for the men and women who are advising our current president, Joe Biden, in dealing with this enormous international crisis?
Well, Rob, every crisis is different, but in my experience, there are some common elements of leadership. And I have to say, although I'm not an objective observer, that I thought President George W. Bush was a superb leader in crisis, and because of these qualities. One is that he understood quickly the magnitude of the situation and knew that the focus of government, maybe even the trajectory of policy in the face of crisis needs to change. And so when 9/11 came around, I wasn't with the president on 9/11. I was in the White House bunker, far below the grounds of the White House, with the vice president. The president was traveling on 9/11. But what I saw from the bunker when we finally established communication with the president was a president who saw faster, really, I think, than anyone else, how radically that attack had changed the nature of U.S. relationship with the world, and was going to have to change both foreign and domestic policy radically. And when on 9/11, on that very day when he convened his war cabinet that included many other officials, he went around the room and basically said to every cabinet official, "Your job just changed." And I remember him looking at the FBI director, the chief federal domestic law enforcement officer, who had been on the job for only about 10 days, and said to him, "Your job just changed. You're used to trying to catch criminals after they commit their acts. Your principal preoccupation now needs to catch the criminals, and in particular the terrorists, before they act." So a clarity of vision from a leader is extremely important. And then they have to be able to communicate that to the American people.
And in your experience, is there a sharing of lessons learned among former and current chiefs of staff?
There is an informal fraternity among the chiefs of staff. There have only been, I would say at this point, about 30 of us who have served as chief of staff to the president. And we, particularly when there's a new chief of staff, we do try to convene as a group.
Josh Bolton, thank you so much for joining us this week on Dakhel, Washington. For more than 35 years, I have been one of the most nonpartisan people in Washington. I work cheerfully and eagerly with leaders and officials from both parties. I support some ideas advocated by each of the parties and reject others supported by each of the parties. I have voted for candidates of both parties, but have never publicly endorsed a candidate, nor have I ever donated to a federal campaign. Perhaps I have lost out on some opportunities as a result of this political balance, but over time, I believe I have been more effective at my job because I have not become a political partisan. These days, though, it's not so easy to retain this distance, this balance, this political even-handedness. That's not because one party has a monopoly on sound, practical ideas or on impressive future leaders. And it's not because there aren't odious, reprehensible, toxic voices in both parties. But it's not so easy to retain this balance because one party has officially gone on record as being political flat earthers. What are flat earthers? Those are people who insist, despite the most compelling evidence possible, that the earth is flat, not round. In political terms, these are people who look at stripes and say they see dots. They look at black and call it white. And specifically, these are people who look at the violent insurrection that occurred on January 6th, 2021, a purposeful effort to stop the certification of a duly elected president, even by threatening to kill the vice president of the United States, thereby constituting the most egregious act of rebellion since the Civil War. And instead of calling it what it is, they officially and formally labeled this legitimate political discourse, quote unquote, words that one would use to describe a high school debate club or a quaint luncheon chat at the local retirement home. This was the official formal declaration of today's Republican Party. It's absurd, of course, on every conceivable level, and no amount of changing the topic by focusing on the absurdities uttered by individual Democratic legislators, and that list is regrettably long too, can obscure the fact that it was the Republican National Committee, not some fringe element of the party, that officially and formally passed a resolution embracing the crime-breaking insurrectionists of January 6th. I try very hard to retain my sense of distance, balance, and even-handedness, but it is increasingly difficult in an environment when one party has officially become the party of political flat earthers. I hope this is a passing fever, a momentary aberration from which the Republican Party will eventually emerge as the sober conservative counterweight to the Democratic Party. They better not wait too long. I'm not sure our national experiment can wait. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بالسياسة إدارة بايدن تجاه روسيا والصين، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.